It is the middle of the night. 40,000 years ago, a baby is screaming, not fussing, screaming the full-body kind that goes on and on. The camp is small, the fire is low, and somewhere out there in the dark is every animal within a mile that now knows precisely where the people are, and that one of them is very small and very weak. You cannot reason with a 4-month-old. You cannot explain the situation. You have no dummy, no white noise machine, no advice book, and nowhere to go. So what do you actually do? The answer turns out to explain something quite uncomfortable about modern parenting, because the reason your baby cries so much may have less to do with your baby than with the world you are asking it to sleep in. Start with a strange fact. Human infants cry more than the infants of any other primate, substantially more. A chimpanzee infant fusses, a human infant produces sustained, escalating, extremely loud vocalization, sometimes for hours. That should not make sense. Loud, helpless offspring in a landscape full of predators is close to the worst possible design. Natural selection ought to have removed that trait quickly and permanently. So either crying is an accident that somehow survived, or crying is doing a job. The job becomes clearer once you understand how uniquely useless a human newborn is. Compare a foal standing within an hour. A human baby cannot hold up its own head. It cannot cling to its mother the way an infant monkey grips fur. Human babies have a grasp reflex, but not the strength to support their own body weight for long. That last part matters more than it sounds. A monkey infant transports itself. It attaches and stays attached. A human infant must be carried deliberately by someone who has decided to carry it, which means the human baby's survival depends entirely on continuously commanding adult attention. It has no other lever, it cannot follow you, it cannot hold on, it can only make a noise that is physically difficult to ignore. And it is difficult to ignore. The acoustic properties of an infant cry are unusually good at provoking a stress response in adults. It is genuinely unpleasant to hear, and that unpleasantness is the mechanism. The cry is not a symptom, it is a tool. So what did they do about it? The first answer is that in a large number of documented foraging societies, the baby was essentially never put down. Ethnographers working among hunter-gatherer groups in the 20th century recorded infants being held or carried for the overwhelming majority of their waking hours. Carried in slings, on hips, against skin, moved from one adult to another, and sleeping in contact with a caregiver at night rather than alone. And the reported crying patterns in these groups were different. Not absent, babies cry everywhere, but shorter, bouts that began and were resolved quickly because the response was immediate and the baby was already in contact with a body. There is a reasonable amount of research suggesting increased carrying reduces crying duration in infants generally, though the size of the effect varies between studies and populations. But the ethnographic picture is fairly consistent on the basic shape, near continuous contact, rapid response, shorter episodes. The second answer is that it was not one exhausted person's problem. This is the part I think modern parents find hardest to hear. In many small-scale societies, infant care is distributed. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, other women in camp, sometimes unrelated adults. Babies are passed around, and a substantial share of the holding is done by people who are not the mother. Researchers call this cooperative breeding, and there is a serious argument that it is one of the defining features of our species, rather than a cultural quirk. So picture the screaming baby again, but properly this time. It is not one woman alone in a dark room at 3 in the morning with no one to hand the baby to and no prospect of relief. It is a camp of 30 people, several of whom are awake anyway, in which the baby moves to a fresh pair of arms when the current pair has had enough. Nobody has to endure the whole thing. That is not a small difference. It may be the entire difference. Feeding worked the same way, not scheduled feeds hours apart, but very frequent, very short feeds on demand, sometimes several times an hour. A baby fed that way is rarely far from its last feed, which removes one of the largest categories of crying before it begins. Now, I am not going to pretend the whole picture is warm. There were circumstances, severe scarcity, a mother already unable to feed an existing child, a birth that came too soon after the last, in which a newborn was not raised. This is documented in the ethnographic record across a range of societies, and it was a decision made under conditions of genuine desperation that are hard for us to imagine from here. I mention it because leaving it out would make this a fairy tale, and it wasn't one. But it is also not the main story, and it was not the routine answer to a crying baby. The routine answer was arms. So here is the turn. We tend to frame infant crying as a problem the baby has, something to be fixed, trained out, scheduled away. Entire industries exist on that premise, but look at what the human infant is actually built for. Constant physical contact, a caregiver within arm's reach at all times, including at night, feeding on demand rather than on a clock, multiple familiar adults, so that no single one is ever depleted, motion being carried while the adult walks, works, talks. Now look at the environment we ask it to develop in, a room of its own, a cot, scheduled feeds, long stretches without contact, and frequently one or two adults doing all of it, alone, with no one to hand over to. The baby is not malfunctioning. The baby is calibrated for conditions that are not present, and it is protesting their absence in the only way it has. This is roughly what people are pointing at with the idea of the fourth trimester, the notion that a human newborn is, in a sense, delivered early and spends its first months expecting to still be somewhere much closer to a body. So if the baby expects to still be inside a body, you give it back as much of that body as you can. Motion, not stillness. A carried baby is walked, swayed, bounced, because that is what being inside a moving woman feels like. A pram that stops is a problem. Sound. The inside of a body is not quiet. It is a low, continuous roar, which is why shushing works, and why a vacuum cleaner works, and why the thing that soothes an infant is never silence. Pressure. Held close, wrapped firm, contained on all sides. Almost every culture on Earth invented this, independently. Motion, noise, pressure, contact. Every one of them is an impression of somewhere the baby has just been. But there is a lie people tell exhausted parents, and I won't tell it. The lie is that if you do it right, carry enough, respond fast enough, the crying stops. It doesn't. Infant crying climbs over the first weeks, peaks around the second month, and then falls away. That curve shows up in societies with completely different care practices. High contact groups get shorter bouts and faster responses. The curve is still there. Carrying changes how long it lasts. It does not abolish it. So if you are doing everything and it is still happening, you have not failed. You have reached the part where there is no technique, only time. Our ancestors had no better answer than you do. They just had more arms to get through it with. Which brings us to the thing our ancestors would have found baffling as a complaint. The idea that a baby should sleep through the night. Human infants are not built for long consolidated sleep. They wake, feed briefly, go back down. For most of our history, that was not a problem to solve, because the person feeding them barely woke up. The baby was already against a body. The awful part of modern night waking is not the waking, it is the distance. Another room, another container, a full return to consciousness several times every night for months. Same biology. Completely different cost. They were woken constantly too. They just never had to walk anywhere. Which leaves the question we opened with. A baby is screaming in the dark, and everything with teeth for a mile knows where the camp is. Why did that not get everyone killed? Partly because a camp was never hidden. 30 people, a fire, the smell of smoke and bodies. Anything out there already knew. The cry gave away nothing. But mostly because the arithmetic ran the other way. A cry that carries might attract something. A cry that doesn't carry means an infant whose needs go unanswered. And in a world with no formula and no medicine, that infant does not last. So the noise survived. Not because it was safe, but because the alternative was worse. Every human alive is descended from babies who were loud enough to be picked up. And there is something in that worth taking if you are in the middle of this right now. The screaming is not a verdict on you, it is an ancient signal, working exactly as designed, sent by a creature that expects to be held by a village. You are not failing to be a village. You have just been handed a job that was never meant to be done by one person. Or two, in a quiet house at 3 in the morning. They had 30. That is the whole trick. And it is worth knowing that the difficulty you are feeling is not weakness. It is the accurate weight of a load that used to be shared.